So I was given the broad topic of the future of education, which means I guess I get to talk about almost anything. So what I've done is I've selected a number of themes that I think have significance for our conversations around the future of credentials and recognition and digital badges in particular. What I'd like to do is to begin by exploring a couple of images just to get us thinking here. I had an informal conversation with a colleague once, and she argued that my ideas are a little bit idealistic, perhaps even a little bit unrealistic. And so her response to me was, that would be nice if unicorns and rainbows existed, but they don't. Well, my first response was, well, yes, rainbows do indeed exist, but then we got into this conversation about unicorns, and so I had, this is actually the illustrator for Stephen King. I don't know if any of you know his novels, but the person who illustrates some of his novels, I had him create this simple graphic to represent the way that I approach education, which is, yes, perhaps something like a unicorn does not exist right now, but it doesn't mean that it can't. It doesn't mean that we don't have the capacity collectively to imagine futures that don't exist and to bring them into existence. And yet we live in a world, especially when it comes to education and learning, where there is a rich tradition, and I don't have any intention of suggesting that we should throw it all out, but it may well be that some of those traditions are inhibiting us, preventing us from tackling some of the most pressing challenges and embracing some of the most exciting opportunities of our age. So as I look at the idea of innovation in education in particular, we have this image that represents the concept of thinking inside the box, right? And I talk to people often about the concept of innovation and why do we this cliche perhaps, but this concept of thinking outside of the box, why do we do that? Why does that have relevance for us who are interested in learning and recognition and education at large? And as I've spent time visiting hundreds of organizations in the United States and beyond, one thing that I found is that those organizations that are most committed to their mission and staying vibrant and living out their distinct mission and their distinct values, is they always seem to have this spirit of innovation that's present within them as well. And the more I looked into that, the more it became evident to me that the reason for that is because organizations that value mission and innovation do so because innovation is what helps them remain faithful to their mission over time. When an organization begins, its mission begins to shape its policies and its practices and its procedures and all of those different kinds of things. Over time, those become traditions. And sometimes those traditions have relevance for the current circumstances. Other times they no longer have that relevance. So an organization that embraces innovation is one that's willing to revisit those policies, practices, and procedures persistently to see whether or not they still are empowering them to address the challenges of the present. Now, this is in the United States, this is the single, one of the most sold toys of all time, Mr. Potato Head. How many are familiar with Mr. Potato Head in the room? I see some hands. It was actually the first toy to ever be advertised on the television in the United States. It came out in 1952. And when the idea emerged even earlier than that. But the original Mr. Potato Head, if some of you may have seen these before, the original Mr. Potato Head, if you opened up the box, it had some small plastic pins shaped like a nose and an ear and eyes. And then you would provide the fruit or the vegetable to create a funny-faced person. Well, this wasn't that far after the Great Depression in the United States, and parents quickly became frustrated at the fact that there was rotten food sitting around the house because children didn't want to let go of their beloved toys that they'd created. And so it actually lasted in that form for about a decade, for about 10 years, and then in 1962, they took they thought perhaps we should add some kind of item in there that students could poke, or the kids could poke, and they could put the eyes in it. And they created an object, and it didn't hold up very well to the rigors of child play. And so they eventually created a plastic version. And children would often create unusual figures where they would put the eye where the nose belongs, or they might put the nose where the ear belongs, and these alien-esque types of creatures. And there was a lot of fun, and I remember as a child doing that sort of thing, and doing things that were a little bit silly and playful. Of course, if you follow this all the way up to its modern version, though, this toy now has different shapes, so that you can't put the eye where the nose belongs, or the ear, because heaven forbid that we teach poor anatomy through a toy, right? And I use this as an analogy for what happens in our learning organizations and our learning environments. That we start with a simple concept, and we start with a few rules or a few approaches. Over time, we create rules and practices and policies, sometimes for safety reasons, sometimes to address a current issue. But over time, those rules and those policies begin to constrict and restrict and prevent us from embracing new possibilities and new opportunities. One of the things that's exciting to me about this room and the people represented in this is that there is a very strong spirit of innovation, of truly reconsidering or reimagining what it looks like to create a more humane, open, accessible means of recognition and the learning that's associated with that. So this is actually a cutting-edge technology of its day. It's a medical technology. It's a skull saw, a bone saw. And if one were in the unfortunate situation where they needed a surgery, making it through their skull, this is what would be used. Now, if I were going to a medical practitioner today and to a doctor, and I needed to have surgery, and the doctor sat me down and walked me through what was going to happen in the procedure, and then she proceeded to explain, I want to assure you, I don't use any of these new fancy technologies and innovations of our day. I use the tried and tested tools of the past. And she pulled out this device. Now, what's so interesting, though, is that for those of us that work in the education space, that is a daily occurrence. We embrace practices of the past that are preferred tools and approaches and procedures that may or may not hold up to the research or may not remain relevant in our current context or circumstance, but our preference rules the day sometimes. So as we get into this conversation about badges and about this emerging ecosystem, I'd like to pose a number of proposals. I had a mentor who once told me that we learn too late that our convictions matter. So as you can tell, mine are out in the public here as I share with you today. But one is that I would argue that we will amplify and we will muzzle voices with our work. All of the work that we're pursuing here today that's represented at each person in the room will contribute to both new winners and new losers. That's the nature of innovation, and it's the nature of technology. Technology, by its nature, has affordances and limitations. It makes new things possible, but in the process, it also makes other things less possible than they were before. Even an initiative that's tried to open learning or open concepts, there will be winners and there will be losers. There will be benefits, there will be downsides. And much of my work, much of my scholarship as an academic has been focused upon exploring those benefits and those limitations, exploring it in a candid and at least somewhat unbiased way. So I'd like to propose that. And as we go about this work of recognition, I find this image to be telling. This is a 1920 image of the Tour de France. And as you may be able to tell in the image, they're taking a little bit of a break in the race. Oh, it's actually during the race. I don't know if you can tell what's happening. Anyone? Can you see what's happening? Yes, he's lighting a cigarette for the man in the middle. So the question is, why would someone be doing that? Well, I don't know, it's France, I don't know, right? So the answer, though, in part was certainly it was a cultural thing, and that was part of the Tour de France. There's a really rich cultural element to it. But also, there were even medical journals of the time that suggested that nicotine is a performance-enhancing drug. So people might have thought that they were actually going to get ahead in the race by doing this. I share that because I think it's a valuable word of caution as we embrace a spirit of innovation that hopefully promotes values that we consider to be valuable, that we consider to be important in society, like we just heard. There is this humility that I believe is important for us, that there is always the possibility that we are doing the equivalent in the world of recognition and credentials. We might not intend to be doing so, but there is the possibility that in 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 years, we'll discover that there were some limitations to our practices that we just didn't foresee or we didn't anticipate. I tend to argue that there's great value, even in the more practical our work becomes, the more applied it becomes, the more important it is for us to be willing to take time in our teams and individually to reflect on what are the potential benefits and downsides, realizing that we'll never surface them all, we'll surface some, and that can help improve the quality of our work. Another illustration that I use as we move forward in this conversation. Does anyone know what this is, by chance? What's that? Okay, it's a combine, and this one is for, actually for tomatoes. If you can see kind of conveyors. So if we go back long enough, the most common way that people would pick tomatoes is they would walk through the field, and they would hand pick the tomatoes, and they would place them in baskets. Only people had to make things bigger and better and faster, and we needed to collect more and save cost, and so we created these wonderful machines. And the next potato pickers were actually a blend of human and technological, where people would sit in these baskets, and the tractor would drive through the field, and you would have to reach down and grab the tomatoes as they would go by. But then they took it to the next level, and they realized that we could replace the human altogether, and we could just use this technology. Now, it was far more efficient, and you could harvest far more tomatoes than ever with a group of individuals, at least for the cost. It eventually became that way. Only there was a problem with it. The tomatoes would be bruised by this machine, even as they refined the machine. And so they had to breed a different type of tomato. So in the United States, if you go to a grocery store today, the tomato skins are very thick, and they don't taste as good as some of the fresh, local kinds of tomatoes, because they bred a specific kind of tomato to tolerate the machine that was created to increase the efficiency. Again, I argue that this is a lesson for us as we think about innovation in this space, that we may be striving for scale or efficiency, but in the process, there will be winners and losers, benefits and limitations. So there's a wonderful, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with these two scholars and others' work around heutagogy. Is that a term? Raise your hand if the term heutagogy is familiar. So in education, there's a concept called pedagogy, and from the Greek, it has to do with the education of the child, leading a child, right? Then we also have a term, andragogy, which is a term that's often used to describe adult learning, the learning that's unique to an adult who has more life experience. And then there are some who have proposed this concept of heutagogy, which is self-determined learning, self-directed learning with feedback loops, empowering people to learn for themselves. And this is the work that this came out of. A lot of Stuart Hayes' work relates to this. And he argues that we are in an age of knowledge and skill emancipation. And coming from the United States, that word emancipation is a loaded word. It has some pretty strong cultural significance. But they're arguing that this is a time of openness, a time of increased access, and a time of opportunity. Whether our organizations embrace that or not, it will happen. It's a nature of life in an increasingly connected and networked world. There's more content and information readily available than ever before, and it's being structured into increasingly meaningful experiences and communities for people. And so as we dive into this, I'd like to argue that as we look forward to the future of education, I think it's undeniable that we will begin to see these forms, this type of a representation of learning begin to emerge more and more in our communities, globally and individually. And I certainly don't mean this exactly literally, but we have in our formal education experiences what I call degree drive, where individuals will often complete a series of courses that lead to a final credential, perhaps a transcript. Maybe they will learn, they'll get some kind of diploma as well. And we do have some. For example, the university where I work, we put together the first master's degree program in the world built around competency-based digital badges. So we used degree drive, but we added some badges within the course. So there was sort of a dual credential process. So we have this pathway that continues to have perceived value in society and in many parts of the world. And then we have this second one that's a street that's gaining new traffic. It's getting more attention with the digital realm, which I would call self-directed street or self-directed learning street, where we have any number of informal and formal learning experiences. And we're starting to see the emergence of new ways to actually recognize that learning in the form of credentials and portfolios and digital badges. And this represents some of the work that's happening in this room as well. And then I argue that there's also continuing education court. And how I distinguish the second and the third is that I describe continuing education court as the learning experiences that are often organized and developed by formal organizations, but they're not necessarily tied to the formal credit and credential of the past in learning organizations. So in the United States, there's an immense amount of money going into, from venture capitals into startup companies in this space. Places, Udacity, I know that Bertelsmann, a German-based company, has invested in Udacity and Udemy and other kinds of groups like that are embracing this. I would argue that also continuing education court represents the spirit of much corporate training that's happening today as well. Now, what's beginning to happen, though, also, and I anticipate that we'll see more and more, is this bridging of the streets, where you notice these small pathways that are connecting these streets in different ways. I see some exciting opportunity in the work that many are doing in this room around that. So what I'd like to do then is I'll finish up here with a series of 7 or 8 contrasts as we think about the future. I would argue that the future is certainly not defined for us, that what we decide and what the people in this room choose to do with it will help shape it. And so I'd like to contrast some different approaches that exist in the education space today. The first one I'd argue is pathways versus gateways. In our last presentation, we heard a lot about pathways. I was heartened to hear about how they were not going the direction of trying to create this one standard. To be a humanitarian, you must go through this training. And yet that's the reality of many more regulated forms of work in the world today. I was working with a particular profession in the United States, ministers. And this was a specific Christian denomination that was struggling because they didn't have enough people graduating to fill the positions that they had available. And when I asked them to explain what it took in order to become a minister in that profession, they had 2 locations in the entire United States. If you were in midway in life, you had to quit your job and move your entire family to one of these 2 locations for 4 years, study Greek and Hebrew, and go through this entire process without an income for 4 years, and then you could proceed to move into it. And so there was no surprise that they were having a shortage. They didn't have a shortage of people that were interested. It's just that they had created such narrow gateways into this profession that they had few people that were willing or able to do that. And we have many professions today that are finding skills gaps, and they're seeking to employ people in a given domain or area, but they've limited the pathways. They've created gateways instead of pathways. And they've done it sometimes for financial reasons, sometimes because they're truly convinced that that is the best or only way in which one should become approved to work in a given profession. And yet I'd argue that as we begin to help people imagine the possibilities for education in the future, we can help people cast a vision for multiple pathways that verify, there can be certainly a level of competence that's verified across pathways, but we could create an openness which can solve some pretty significant social issues today if we were willing to do that. In the 19th century, the Luddite movement, how many of you, anyone here consider themselves a Luddite? Okay, very good. All right, very good. I call myself a Ludvocate. I have a spirit of advocacy for the new emerging innovations and affinity for some of the challenges as well. And so some of you may know that the Luddites were people who were displaced from the textile industry whenever machines came in the 19th century. And so there was this mythical character, Ned Ludd, and people would actually go into the factories at night and they would break apart the machines, mostly out of rage and disappointment and frustration with the status and the like, and realizing that their job was no longer valued by society or by their employers, and it was impacting their families and their livelihood. Now, what I'd like to argue, though, so we have that reality, and that concept Luddite today is oftentimes used for people who are a little bit more skeptical about the innovations of our day and wanting to raise a voice and be heard that there are some downsides to it. I certainly think that that's valuable. That's an important voice to be heard in the larger conversation. Yet what I'm suggesting is that as we get into this conversation about pathways versus gateways, I'd like to suggest that we are going to see in the near future a new kind of Luddite rebellion. In fact, we've already seen it, and it's by the factories, not by the workers. We have organizations that have established themselves, and their financial model and the way in which they structure and their livelihood depends upon maintaining gateways. It depends upon limiting the pathways that people have into certain professions and into displaying their knowledge and their expertise. These models are built upon that. And so we're already starting to see that. And I represent my direct context in the United States. An immense amount of policy work on the federal level is done for individuals trying to protect their market or their domain. And so they want to restrict, they want to increase the level of regulation around certain jobs and certain levels of preparation so that they can protect their business model. And that will, I anticipate that will get more intense before we begin to have what will ultimately happen, which is the victory of pathways. Unless technology and the internet goes an opposite direction, I'm not quite convinced that these institutions will be able to maintain that position much longer. They're going to have to innovate and imagine new ways to accomplish their mission and achieve their financial goals. So with this in mind, policies and standards, we have protecting corporate, educational, and government control versus protecting public interests and individual rights. I think in the badge space, this is a critical question for us to begin to continue to ask as we look at this. This is certainly not an argument against the role of corporate. I include all three as valuable parts of society and of solutions. It's just the question is whether or not policies and standards will be created to protect these interests, or whether we'll use policies and standards on the governmental levels and in our core agencies and different professions to truly protect public or professional interests and individual rights. Another one is contrasting the idea of competency as static versus competency as dynamic. In the conversation about standards and competencies and verifying that people are competent, we sometimes overlook the reality that competence changes over time. In fact, the reality is right now I have 5 degrees, I've studied at 20 universities, I have lots of different credentials and so forth, but I don't know how much of that I actually remember or I apply. But it doesn't change the fact that I have the credentials that I could show to someone, right? I was intrigued, Serge, by some of your comments about sort of the future of badges and how we might actually be able to create a model that could recognize competencies, growth and development and adjustment over time, and how we could create a badge system that truly recognizes that. Because as it stands right now, we do have expiration dates we can work with, but beyond that, we're somewhat limited. And this is something that's going to, if the concept of competency is arguing that we want to verify that people are truly competent to accomplish a given task or conduct certain work or something like that. And yet, the models that we're using for competency-based education still seem to disregard this reality that competency is not static. It's actually dynamic. A next one to contrast would be summative credentialing versus formative credentialing. So in the assessment world, in education, we sometimes talk about the difference between formative and summative assessment this way. Formative assessment is the checkup at the doctor. You go maybe once a year or however often to see how you're doing. The doctor may recommend a medication or that you change your eating habits, or you might go on some longer walks or something like that. Try to be preventative, right? But the summative assessment is the autopsy. There's not much the doctor can do for you, right? And in education, depending upon the educational organization, there has tended to be a pretty strong emphasis upon summative assessment. The letter grades that might be used and what goes on the transcript and permanent records. And yet, I'd like to suggest that if competency is not static, but it's dynamic, there might be some real value and benefit if we have a commitment to openness and lifelong learning to think about how credentials can be formative in nature, how they can be representing people's progress over time. And so this one, I'm not going to talk about this a great deal, but there are a number of textbook publishers and others that are sort of reimagining the world of content in a digital and connected age, and they're starting to recognize that the interaction with the content could benefit from feedback loops that could go to a teacher, to the learner. It could actually be software so that the content adjusts in real time based upon the learner's interaction with the content. And it can lead to a automated adjustment from the software. It could be the learner's personal reflection on that feedback and then adjusting him or herself. Or it could be the teacher involved, and certainly there are other options available as well. I'd like to suggest that there's some real opportunity and possibility in imagining credentialing as part of this, and recognition systems that acknowledge this emerging world of formative assessment. The next one is credentialism versus matchmaking. So credentialism is a concept from the 1970s. And some people argue that it never existed, but in my research, it seems it's pretty hard for me to deny it. The concept of credentialism comes out, I'll give you a specific case or scenario. Imagine a person applied for a job, and the job had listed a minimum requirement of a bachelor's degree, in any field, perhaps. And the reason the employer put bachelor's degree as a minimum requirement was because it made it easy for them to sift through a large volume of applicants and just to limit it to people. They figured if someone went through university for 4 years, that they're more likely to have the skills that they want. Yet in the process of doing that, they restricted a number of people from applying to the job who might have been able to do the job as well or better than a person with that credential. And in the 1970s with some of the early studies, and then more recently, when they actually reviewed the skill sets required on the job, they recognized that there is not always a careful alignment between what one gets at university and what was required for this specific job. And that's what I mean by credentialism, where we have unnecessarily restricted people from opportunities in society and in work and other places by creating gateway credentials that aren't necessarily the most effective measures of people's readiness. So the future, I'd like to suggest, we have this intersection of emerging credentials and big data and learning analytics that could provide us with some compelling visions of the future, where credentials and people's learning over time and a documentation, a recognition of people's learning in formal and informal spaces, that data can be mined. Semantic analysis, both numeric and qualitative data could be mined, and it could actually compare what's happening in that person's life and their learning with other people with whom they might want to connect or partner, just for personal interest or for networking, but also with potential employers, potential organizations within their community that relate with them. So this opportunity for sort of a matchmaking, a dating service, as you will, for opportunities and experiences in life. And so I see this also as an interesting opportunity for us. The role of portfolio, I still think, especially as we get into semantic analysis, the ability to summarize what a portfolio means in numeric and in sort of a shorthand way, will continue to have some great opportunities. But I'd like to argue that we have to make decisions about whether we'll perceive portfolios as simply a collection of credentials and artifacts, or whether we're willing to kind of think about it more holistically as a dynamic personal narrative, a story that's unfolding day after day as a person goes throughout their life. And then we find ways to actually analyze that narrative, content analysis, discourse analysis, semantic analysis. Some of these methodologies, we could build software and tools that allow us to highlight key elements from those stories. Then we find that we also have this question about standardizing versus personalizing, or both or neither. And this is a famous cartoon that some of you may have seen before, where the teacher says, right, for a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. Please climb that tree. And yet we realize that perhaps we need to have a measure of personalization based upon where the people, or they're not all people, sorry, where the different animals are represented. So we largely still have an education system that still works from the assumption that standardization is appropriate, that it's the most humane thing to do, it's the most equitable thing to do. And yet that's working from the assumption that every person is coming in with the same experiences, the same skill set, the same levels of confidence and competence, the same opportunities. And so the spirit of the personalization movement is not about simply giving students randomly whatever they want, and right, like teachers just trying to make the students happy regardless. I'd argue that the spirit is this. It's meant to try to avoid wasting one of the most precious resources we have on this planet, which is human capacity and opportunity. So the individual opportunity in each person, how do we capitalize upon that? And so there are a couple of ways I'll represent this. One, Catherine Church, in the world of counseling and psychology, she published a book that was unlike any book before it. In 1995, she wrote a book called Forbidden Narratives, where she worked in the mental health world as a mental health professional. And as she did, she found herself for the first time in her life in a need of mental health assistance. And she was put into a full-time care facility to help her work through her mental health issues. And as she did, she found herself as both a patient and a professional in the field. And so she began to approach her research in a completely different way than had ever been done in the field before, where she is writing as both the patient who's being cared for, but she's also still that professional who understood the field. And so we had a voice of the patient that began to shape and influence the field. And this is an exciting opportunity, I'd argue, for us. If we're going to personalize, what are opportunities for us to hear the voices of the learners, and for them to actually help to shape and even perhaps be the ones who build recognition systems and be issuers of credentials and so forth. There's Jane McGonigal, whose work is largely around game-based learning, or games in education and so forth. She has a great quote that's not about education, but it's about healthcare, and I would argue that this applies to recognition and education as well. Where positive health means becoming wholeheartedly engaged with our own healthcare. It means not outsourcing our health to the healthcare system. It means getting rid of the fear and paralysis we too often feel, and instead cultivating a sense of agency. The question is, how can we build further, as we're talking about reimagining badges or the next generation of badges and new forms of recognition, how can we build a recognition system that empowers a growing sense of agency in more and more people? There's a Mark Treadwell. I was speaking at a keynote in Hong Kong last year, and Mark Treadwell had this great claim. He argued that our school systems, not intentionally, but unintentionally, convinced 80% of the students that they are not smart, increasing their contentment with less complex jobs. And his argument is that we need to reimagine our learning ecosystem so that we're creating a system that convinces 80% of the students that they are smart and able agents, because that's what our world and our societies need. I'd like to argue that maybe we shouldn't settle for 80%. So then, I think this is my last one, is the contrast of learning as lumber versus learning as a forest. So as we're diving more and more into this world of competency-based education and other areas like that, there's some immense opportunities, some wonderful positive opportunities that are present. But there is always this danger that in the process, we'll begin to dissect and to cut down the knowledge into these discrete pieces. We'll begin to break it apart so that it's little more than a lumber yard. And I think everyone in this room who's had a wonderful walk through a forest would agree that a walk through a forest and a walk through a lumber yard is qualitatively different. And we don't want to lose the one at the risk of the other. So I'd like to just argue that that's also an important consideration for us to continue to keep in mind as we move forward with these conversations about recognition. Kieran Egan, I tend to appreciate a lot of his work at Simon Fraser University in The Future of Education. He argued that knowledge is naturally grounded in human hopes, fears, and passions. And even for those of us who are deeply invested in workforce development and tasks that are very technical in nature and so forth, I'd like to argue that a compelling future of education is one that doesn't lose sight of this deeply human element that goes behind learning throughout our lives. That all knowledge, at least that which has deep meaning to us, is in one way or another related to human hopes, fears, and passions. Thank you. Do we have time for questions?
Yes, we have time for questions.
Okay, very good. Or comments or questions, if you'd like to contribute something. Trained as a teacher, I've always been trained to wait at least 20 seconds whenever I ask for questions. Yes.
Hi, so talking about hopes, fears, and passions, do you think it's possible to work on a curricula, of an educational curricula, especially for schools, that helps students to deal with their hopes, fears, and passions?
I do, and I spend quite a bit of time working in the primary and secondary education systems in the U.S. as well as tertiary. But there are a number of wonderful experiments in schools within the United States and other parts of the world that are trying to do this very thing. Some of them are, there's a whole realm of literature called passion-based education that they would argue is tied to this, where we're not necessarily starting with the formal curriculum, but we're starting with some of the passions and the fears and the challenges that are perceived and lived and experienced by the students on a daily basis. About a month ago, I came back from a school in the United States. It was actually a group of parents and others that want to start a new kind of school. And I spent a day with them to help them shape a vision for their school. What would be the key attributes of their school? And what they decided is that they're going to create a new kind of high school, secondary school, where the entire curriculum will be built upon solving the most pressing problems in the students' lives, their families' lives, and the lives of people in their community. And so it will be a problem-based curriculum. And the teachers will have the role. They do still have standards, and they have to get science and math and other things in there along the way. The teacher's role will be helping the students to discover how those disciplines can help them address these pressing problems in their lives and in their communities. So I do see it is indeed possible because I've seen it happen firsthand.
Well, you're talking about the objects that create fears and passions. I'm talking about the emotions. I'm talking about fears and passions, not the objects of fear and passions.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would argue that as this is happening, these themes and these topics are emerging from what the students communicate as fears and passions, but they become grounded then in how I'm going to respond to these. What do I want to do with this fear that's present? Is it a matter of recognizing it? Is there something that I want to try to address in society as a basis of this fear? So that's really where they connect, at least for the schools that I've seen so far.
All right, thanks.
I'm not sure what my question is, but maybe it's more a comment. I guess I'm thinking of the concept of self-agency as a very individualized concept, which is not valued or necessarily desirable in all cultures. So I think this touches on Atish's presentation as well in terms of the solutions and the knowledge sometimes being in the community and not being attached to a specific individual. So I'm glad at the beginning of your presentation you talked about, the voices we muzzle versus amplify, because I'm wondering where is the place of the community versus the individual in a system of badges?
Absolutely. I think that's a great question. I would argue that agency, it certainly does tend to I think a lot of the discourse and the literature does emerge from sort of a Western understanding of the role of the individual and so forth. I think, and this is not the first time that question has come up, and I'm still kind of thinking through it myself a little bit, but I think the way that those questions, they've helped me broaden my understanding of agency is, the question is, how does one perceive their role individually and as part of the community? And so the voice of the way in which these questions emerge, I think that is going to be deeply contextual, and it might emerge through individual reflection in some contexts more, and in other contexts it will emerge from groups that are collectively doing this. And I've visited, even within the United States, as I visit different types of schools that are trying to nurture this sense of agency, some are much more collective in their vision for this, and in others there are individual projects that students sort of establish themselves. Some have groups or teams of individuals, so it starts with this collective sense.
Bernard, there was one thing I was waiting for you to mention, and you covered a lot of things that I hadn't thought of, but there was one thing I was waiting for you to mention, which was public interest versus private control of the assessment and the recognition. And I'm wondering if you can comment on that.
Well, I think that's the only place where I did address that was about the role of policy, so I guess that's where I've spent most of my time thinking about this so far, sort of that public interest versus private control. The question, though, is a lot of the private influence is communicated in the form of this is in the public's interest, right? So it's not nearly as clear as just sort of one or the other, as or none of those, right? The lines start to be blurred quite a bit, and I honestly am not always able to tell the difference between the two. This is coming from an academic who has done consulting for private interest groups and written those nice white papers with non-disclosure forms and so forth. And that's honestly a struggle that I still have. I don't know if I have a great response to that. It's just, I do think that the tension, it's important to maintain that tension, not to kind of give in to it.
When it comes to a near future of recognition of learning, what are the things that you would like to experiment the most with?
Oh, for me, in the future of education, you're saying?
Yes.
Oh, that's a great question. So, just for me personally, I don't usually get those questions. I'm ready for vacation.
Looking for the next blog post then.
So, I'm very interested in this role of data and analytics. I don't anticipate that redirecting my scholarship. My work is certainly more in the realm of think pieces and sort of the philosophical, theoretical realm and so forth. But I'm intrigued by whether or not we can't follow this learning analytics and big data movement. If we see it through, I think there's a larger human side. If we persist with it long enough, there's this humanness that I'm missing in the current discourse that I think we can find at some point. So I would like to spend a little bit more time in that realm. It certainly intersects with gamification and so forth. And then a lot of my work more recently has been in the realm of self-directed learning and, again, nurturing that sense of agency. So I'd definitely like to spend more time on that. All right, well, thank you very much.
I have one,
sorry, go ahead.
One question. It's about education is a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you believe in education, you can succeed. And what we see more and more, at least it's the case in France, where people don't believe in education because their parents are unemployed. In school, there are 2 generations of parents that have been unemployed, so they don't think that they can do anything with their life. So the question is, how do you break this vicious circle, this curse of the self-fulfilling prophecy that education won't bring people anywhere? And how do you, this idea of self-agency, how can we make the learners, the pupils, the students, the agents to break this curse?
Right, I think there's so many answers to that question, right? So I'll just pick one for our time that relates to our interest here around recognition. Recognition is incredibly powerful. And a lot of times in our conversations, for example, about badges, we immediately jump to questions about trust and value from employers and outside organizations. But one of the things that was a big aha moment for me in our own use of badges was we ran into some glitches early on, and then we switched to a new badge system. So we have a master's degree program that's built around competency-based digital badges, and we haven't been issuing badges for a while. We're just starting to issue. We're using Pearson Acclaim, and we're going to be reissuing a bunch of them here soon. And yet, what was the big discovery for me was that it wasn't the issuing of badges that was key. What was happening is that the learners were by recognizing these accomplishments in more discrete ways, the learners were beginning to see that the skill and its value, and I do believe, for example, a neat thing about the badge system we're using is that it does tie to national job databases. So this isn't necessarily about finding a job, but whenever I demonstrate that I've mastered a new skill or concept, or I've created an artifact that shows a greater level of knowledge or expertise, that now I actually can have tags in there, and I can click on it, and it will show me all of the jobs out there that have this in demand. That's a very kind of technical, specific idea, but I think that concept can be amplified quite a bit, is by helping people to see their accomplishments in more discrete, visible ways, we can help build that sense of confidence and competence that comes with that. Thank you.